Okay, y'all, it is a beautiful Easter Sunday, and we are going to be filming outside. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the story of Easter because I'm realizing that a lot of people miss the point. I was driving the other day and saw somebody with a whole bunch of Easter decorations up outside of their house with a thin blue line flag hanging up. And it got me thinking about the way that people miss the context of the story. The story starts with a guy whose dad worked in construction. Even when he left home to become a traveling speaker and activist, he was broke all his life. He built up a big following, but in those days, prophets claiming to be the promised Messiah, there were a dime a dozen. The people of Palestine were colonized by Rome. They were desperate for a leader to rise up that they could get behind. So to the religious leaders of the time, those prophets were dangerous people who would just make everything worse. In those days before the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish people's Passover tradition was a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So when Jesus got there were already Roman troops everywhere, just ready for something to pop off. So when he comes in, this guy from the sticks, and people start cheering in the streets about a new king for the Jewish people, the religious leaders of the time got really nervous. Historical records don't uphold this idea of Pilate that we have as some weak puppet. He was ruthless in crushing rebellions. Rome had put him there to keep the locals obedient to the empire, and he would crush any sign of rebellion. So the priests started asking Jesus to shut this down. When the crowd started cheering, what they were saying was, make it stop or you're going to get us all killed. And there are real parallels there to how in the 2020 protests, people looked at the way the protests were being managed and said, what do you expect the cops to do if you're provoking them? So then Jesus goes and does his whole flipping tables in the temple thing, and the priests have to figure something out because they're afraid their whole community is going to get cracked down on. And the lesson there isn't about the impact of fear and the destructive potential of choosing fear of retribution over love of community. So what did they do? They found someone vulnerable who was close to Jesus, who had the most to lose if the Romans came down on them. And they flipped him. And one of the things we lose in translation is why Judas was vulnerable to that play. That requires a real understanding of who he was. The name he's given in the text is Iscariot, which scholars believe is a form of the word Sicarii, a rebel group known for the daggers they carried. This guy had a record for what in modern times would have been called terrorism. Even before he spent years on the road with Jesus, he would have probably spent time evading the Roman authorities. If he'd waited for the law to catch up, he'd be as screwed as Jesus. And this deal they offered him, it was juicy. When this says 30 pieces of silver, we're not talking quarters here. When he tries to back out of the deal, give the money back, and they won't take it, he goes out and buys a plot of land with this. This payoff was enough for him to buy real estate. So this guy has gone from a fugitive to a roadie to a landowner. And as the partner of a stagehand, let me just say, must be nice. But he's so racked with guilt with this that he goes out to that land and he takes his own life. The way we as a community avoid situations like that is to understand the conditions that make the people in our circles vulnerable, and we give them support. Our movements crumble when we start putting the needs of the movement above the needs of the people. Because if Judas had had stable housing and access to legal representation, it would have been a lot easier for him to say no to that deal. So Jesus gets arrested, and they take him to the Roman appointed governor, Herod. He reports directly to Rome, and Jesus won't do any miracles for Herod's amusement. So Herod figures this isn't normal apocalyptic Judaism of the time. This is political, which means it's over his pay grade, and he ships him off to Pilate in the ancient equivalent of a magistrate denying bond. Funny how we see that the system hasn't changed that much. Jesus gets to Pilate, and this trial is a joke. It's a foregone conclusion that he's going to be convicted, just like we knew the outcome here in Charlotte when Raekwon Borum went on trial for a killing that witnesses say they saw CMPD commit. There was no way in either case that either man was getting an acquittal. For Raekwon to be innocent would mean the state admitting to the murder of Justin Carr, and for Jesus to be innocent would mean they admitted to the oppression of the Jewish people. The nature of power has not changed, and for poor people from oppressed groups, the evidence matters less than whether they're a threat to the system. So Pilate goes to the crowd to manufacture their consent. He says, "Do you want me to release Jesus, or do you want me to release Barabbas, who has been convicted of murder?" It's not a real choice, of course. If they'd said they wanted Jesus, Pilate would have crushed them too. And they knew it. But now that they've said Barabbas, Pilate can say that he's given them a choice. And even now, the state uses that illusion of choice to make us complicit in state violence. So Jesus is beaten, tortured, executed in the slowest, most painful way the Romans had. And as he's hanging there dying, remember how I said the Roman army was basically cops? Well, they're sitting there doing what cops do. Instead of showing any compassion for this person who's dying a slow, painful death, they break out their lots and are gambling right in front of him to see who gets his clothes when he dies. We know the rest. The quick burial, the resurrection. And from a religious standpoint, that's framed as the important part of the story. But for those of us who live under a violent, oppressive state, the story is valuable because it reminds us that the way power operates is constant enough to learn from. Put bluntly, the cops killed Jesus. He was a victim of state violence like so many have been after him. So I don't want to hear the first "he is risen" or see the first chocolate bunny or a brunch selfie from any one of you if you're not standing up for the other people targeted in that way. The best and only way to honor a victim of violent state oppression 2,000 years ago is to take care of the oppressed people who are in front of us right now.